So as a heads up, I do record the classroom portion of all classes, and they will all be posted the following Monday, and you'll get a complete set of slides, any follow-up notes that we talked about, anything like that, you'll get it Monday. And the recordings are really there, especially if you miss a class, right? It's nice to be able to go back and kind of see what we were talking about. So no worries if you need to miss a class. Although for most of our classes, we will have an outdoor component, and so like if you're into pruning, I would highly recommend making the pruning class because that's just easier to teach on a tree than really teach here. Yeah, awesome. So a little bit about the Tree Keeper program, and then, well, I'll actually introduce myself first. I'll jump around a little bit. So, hey, I'm Ashley. I am the Durham County Horticulture Agent. As part of my job, I oversee the Master Gardeners. About almost half of you are Master Gardeners. If you're not familiar with that program, these are highly trained volunteers. We put them through about 16 weeks of training, and then they have annual requirements. It's a statewide program. It's actually a nationwide program. And if you include South Korea, Canada, and Great Britain, it's an international program. So it's pretty cool. It's about 50 years old now. And so that's really fun. We have about 120 of those folks working in the county, just sharing horticultural information. A little bit of my background. I grew up in Indiana, just outside Indianapolis. I spent all of my summers basically on a lake in Michigan at a summer camp. And I was the kid who like wanted the fact sheets of tree names and turtle names and that kind of stuff. And everyone else was like running around tearing it up. And I was like, oh, guidebooks. So
which lake from Michigan?
It's Lake Corey. It's a small lake. It's kind of in like southwest. It's like here-ish.
Flip around.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry, here-ish. So I'm originally from here-ish, but I moved when I was 2. So you know, I'm not a true. I can't truly Michigan the way I should.
And only Michiganders know.
I know. So it's also the joy of like left and right when you're in front of a crowd. So anyway. I went to school at Indiana University for biology. I was lucky enough to work out at research stations in Western Virginia doing bird work. I was also really fortunate during that time to do volunteer coordination for 4 years for a nonprofit that focused on a food pantry and also urban community gardens with a kind of an organic perspective. And so that was really formative for me. Came to Duke to go to grad school. I studied dung beetles, not the ones that roll the dung. They get all the press. I studied the ones that buried the dung underneath. It was fun, and then I ended up studying the full-time a West Coast wildflower, so I did a lot of field work. That was really interesting. That was great, but by the time I got done with that, I was like, you know, it was really fun seeing people and actually working with plants, because the trick here is that you think you're doing this, and then you end up staring at a computer for a year, and you're like, wait a minute, I've been had. So I came to Cooperative Extension because I love research, I love science communication, I love working with people, I love working with volunteers. I really like helping people find their spot and figuring out kind of how they're going to give back, and I love nature. So this was kind of my perfect place to do that. Like I said, most of my time is spent on the Master Gardener program, really training, kind of working with those folks, but I also do things like this that are actually just part of the horticulture program, even though Master Gardeners do a lot of it. So it's a little bit about me. Sometimes I look at a teacher and I'm always like, who are you? Where did you come from? What do you do? Like, why are you teaching this? This is why I'm teaching this. In a lucky kind of turn of events, I was also raised by a forester and a soil scientist. So we've been building toward this for a while. This is just like nepotism at its finest. So for the Tree Keeper program, and this is really helpful for you guys to know, this is actually a really, really, really kind of cross program. Good morning. And we'll take a break halfway through, you guys, so don't worry. There will be a break. The Tree Keeper program is really, really cool because it crosses so many different programs across Durham. So Tree Keepers are really a partnership, and they are a partnership between Trees Durham, the City of Durham, and Keep Durham Beautiful. And all 3 of these organizations are really kind of cool in and of themselves. So City of Durham, it's specifically kind of the urban forestry department. So the folks who are really responsible for all those street trees, right? So these are the people who are handling the trees in, a lot of times in those sort of planting strips right between the sidewalk and the street. Sometimes affectionately referred to as the hell strip, but you know, it's kind of that really hard planting strip. These folks typically are actually not managing a lot of the trees in parks, which is funny, that's managed by Parks and Rec, but they're the ones who are kind of responsible for so many of these really big tree plantings that we see, where they're gonna go down an entire street. And they also have to maintain our aging willow oaks. Keep Durham Beautiful is like kind of an interesting thing where it's a little bit city and a little bit its own thing, and has kind of an office in a city building, but it is its own nonprofit. They do a whole bunch of different things. You might know them from litter leaders, from Creek Week, from everything like that. Tree Keepers kind of was partially born of that program, but it has since kind of moved over, and the goal is eventually for it to be managed by this third organization, Trees Durham. Trees Durham, you might learn a little bit more about it on the last class, but really what Trees Durham is Trees Durham is an organization that was founded, a nonprofit, in response to what we've come to know about historic tree planting and how so much of our current tree cover is informed by racist redlining practices in the 20s and around that time. And so, for example, the city of Durham had a long time a policy, which makes a lot of sense on its face, of replacing trees as they died. However, if you never planted trees in a certain area because of racist policy, they won't die, you won't replace them, they will still not have tree cover, right? And so Trees Durham came out to really kind of try and holistically approach that, and their focus is really on kind of environmental justice and tree cover. So those three work together. They manage the group. I believe it's going to be Keep Durham Beautiful this year that will be sending out kind of newsletters and updates on tree planting activities. They will be sending out information. Cooperative Extension is here really because we're the teachers. Like, this is what we do, this is what we're good at. We run trainings, we do teaching, we do field days, we do all of that. And so I kind of stepped in to say, hey, like, these trainings actually are a little bit of work. If you guys want to work on the rest of the program, Cooperative Extension is willing to do the training, the initial training for the program. What I will say is that as awesome as it is to have multiple organizations, sometimes communication is a little bit hard, right? And I just want to be really, really honest with everyone that if you're excited about being a tree keeper and helping with tree plantings, part of what you'll need to do is make sure that you're also checking their websites, checking their calendars, and if you have a question, reach out to someone, right? Like, they all want to talk to you. I might recommend first reaching out to Keep Durham Beautiful. They kind of have the most capacity right now. Just find their website. They have a whole little tree keeper section on it, right? Like, I just want to be really, really honest that this is not going to be the volunteer opportunity where someone's like beating down your door, right? This is going to be the one where maybe you need to check and say like, hey, what can I do to help? And to be totally honest, that's like, from a nonprofit perspective, very helpful. You know, we all want to do good work, and we're a little tired. So it's very helpful. So over the course of class, we're going to cover, for this first class, kind of tree basics, what I like to think of as right tree, right place, so a little bit of site selection and understanding, am I picking a tree for a spot? Am I picking a spot for a tree? Am I picking something in between? How do I kind of do that? Next place is going to be planting, next class is going to be planting, and that's going to include a fair bit of like tree overview, so different types of trees you might be interested in. That class will be taught by Katie Rose Levin. She was the founding director of Trees Durham. She is a board certified master arborist. She's phenomenal, really, really excellent. You guys are in much better hands on that kind of stuff with her than with me. Third class will be pruning. We'll have a fair bit of hands-on in that one where we will break out into smaller groups and we'll go corral some of the trees in the area kind of back into shape, because so many of these trees are street trees that basically are managed by the city, so we can have our way with them. And then finally, we'll do a little bit of Tree Keepers A to Z, and that will include Katie Rose coming back and talking to us about some of that, about historic tree cover, kind of a broader environmental justice perspective. Why do we do this? Why does it matter? And then we'll segue into volunteer oversight, and basically how do you get a crew going, and how do you kind of keep everyone happy and healthy and planting trees and all that kind of stuff. Good? All right. And so my goal is to get about halfway through, and then we'll take a break, see how we're doing on our time, and then do the second half. We might end up ending a little bit early today because I don't think we're doing our outdoor activity, which is fine because it was just going to be us like staring at a site being like, what are the problems here? Which is helpful and fun, not in the rain. right? Like, that is one of those activities that is directly as fun as the weather. All right, so today we're going to cover tree biology, kind of tree basics. What do trees need? This is a fair bit of soil science, actually, because, spoiler alert, growing plants is mostly growing soil. Right tree, right place, and then probably not head outside. So, thinking about even what trees can do for us, right? So, this is something that there's actually a lot of really, really fascinating research coming out all the time on what trees can do, and especially what they can do in urban environments. So, there's kind of this classic tree planting that so many of us think of where it's like a massive hedgerow, and that's fine. It's useful in some circumstances. It actually is extremely useful to have diverse hedges in agricultural sites because it stops wind stops soil from blowing off. It actually is really, really important for erosion control and for kind of soil management. Obviously, trees can be absolutely beautiful. They can add so much to our landscape if we think about what we want in terms of form, color, all of these different aspects. They can have nice leaves, they can have nice bark. They can provide shade. This is one of those things that's actually amazing because if you think about the shade provided by a tree like this, they can actually lower temperatures by about 10 degrees. So one of the goals for Durham moving forward is to have it, I think they're trying to get to almost basically 50% tree cover, and that's every other step you take would be in shade because it's going to drastically lower temperatures, which when you think about an urban environment where we have so much concrete's a heat sink. It holds temperatures, right? And so without blocking that sunlight from both hitting the concrete but then also shading where it did hit, you can really, really improve kind of overall quality of life. Yeah.
Do you know what the current tree cover is in Durham?
So kind of. So I've read the numbers and I can give you an approximation, but I can give you kind of the more important nuance to it. So our current tree cover is actually not that far off their target, but it's extremely spotty. So even though you might have a neighborhood like Trinity Park that has extremely high tree cover, you have neighborhoods in East Durham and in basically historically redline districts that have no tree cover. So it's like we have this average that is what we're working toward, but it's because we have highs and lows, not because we actually like hit the value we wanted, and so much of the tree cover is, like I said, those old willow oaks that are aging out. So it's kind of like if we don't have a plan, we will not even be able to maintain the fact that we're close to our goal. Yeah.
Why is willow oak so popular on House Street?
So the willow oaks are popular for really interesting reasons, I think, actually. So part of that, and I'm kind of shooting from the hip. I'd have to look at the development ordinance specifically, but there's a unified development ordinance, the UDO, that kind of guides tree plantings and all sorts of everything else about development across the area. And they have lists of trees that are associated with that. And so basically a developer will be told, you need to plant one of these, move on, right? So they pick their tree. It doesn't necessarily mean it was the best tree anymore or that it was the best tree for the site. They pick from their list, they move on, they've satisfied their thing, which is fair. I mean, if you tell me I have to pick from a list, and I don't know anything about trees, probably gonna pick the one I can find, put it in, and be like, done, right? Like, I was here to build a building. In the health strip specifically, luckily, they're really moving away from that, and part of that comes through the good work of, like, the city of Durham, in that they're trying to do these diverse plantings both in how quickly they mature, what their size is, taking into account power lines, but historically we have all these willow oaks hanging out. The reason we have willow oaks from a historic perspective is because there was, I forget his name, but there was a forester who was associated with Duke, who about 100 plus years ago now started advocating for massive amounts of tree cover. He liked willow oaks. If you go back and you look at his notes even, there's like my favorite thing I've ever seen. He notes, this should not be a problem for the power lines because I assume they will be buried. You know, so like he thought this would be resolved. But you know, even then when they did go through, they started planting these trees because they are, given enough space, they're beautiful. Right, given enough space, this is a massive, beautiful tree. Their form, if I'm out walking and I see one that hasn't been mangled, I can tell you it's almost always one of the best trees I see on my walk. But they were forced into this environment that, wasn't set up for them really, and they were all planted at the exact same time, and they were all the same species, so they all die at the same time. Whereas if instead you picked things that matured at different rates and at different heights, they're gonna die at different times too, which is really helpful, because you don't actually want everyone to die all at once. Oh, just beautiful, right? So this is another case too where you can have evergreen trees, you can have beautiful flowers, all these different things you might want to be thinking about and considering. Just cool trees, right? So something like bald cypress, which is a needled tree that loses its needles, so it looks like an evergreen until the moment it's not. It can get these weird wobbly knees. There's an idea that maybe they are helping to stabilize in these sort of wet soils. Sometimes there's an idea that they can get oxygen this way, but it's a lot of stabilization as well. So these can be really interesting, right? Like trees can serve so many purposes. And part of what we know too is even in urban areas, if you pick for diverse foliage, so diverse leaf shapes, different leaves actually catch different types of particulates, so different pollutants in the air. And they can be really, really effective filtering. So there are studies that have been done, I believe it was in Europe, where they basically had an urban street and they added planter boxes with these little trees right in front of some houses and not in others. And then they measured particulate pollution on the inside of those houses. And if you got those little trees planted right in front of your house, you had less particulate pollution inside, right? So they're really good at filtering, and different leaf shapes filter in different ways, right? So there's all these reasons for us to think about diversity, not just from how do we maintain tree cover, but also what are they doing for us? In addition, and we'll talk about this a little bit more moving forward, in addition to just straight up shading to provide cooling, they're actually one of our best cooling mechanisms through transpiration. And we'll talk about why that is, but trees sweat, and we're all so much better for it. Increasingly, we're thinking about natives. Native trees do provide vital habitat. If you look at something, and we'll talk about this more toward the end of class, something like an oak can support hundreds of species of caterpillars and other insects, and those insects are the basis of a food chain that supports birds and everyone else, right? Plant leaves are actually really hard to eat. We eat succulent little lettuces, right? But the vast majority of plant leaves, if you went to try out and eat them, right? You don't want to eat a bunch of oak leaves. You don't want to eat a bunch of that kind of stuff. Insects have figured out how to do that in a really effective, efficient way for different species. And so they're the basis of a food chain. That if you're feeding the insects, which so many of our native trees are, you're feeding everybody else. Doug Tallamy, if you have not read Nature's Best Hope, just if you're a reader, put it on your list. He's been making the rounds. He's been extremely popular in the last couple of years. He's an entomology professor, and he's really started talking about how native plantings and native diversity really we can basically all add it to our own small bits of landscape to kind of reconstitute part of what we're missing. Wildly popular guy. He likes oaks so much that his follow-up book was just The Nature of Oaks, right? And this is entirely on kind of the benefits of oaks and native trees. So for a lot of, oh yeah, go ahead.
I think Doug Tallamy is speaking in Cary. They're having an environmental series, so he's speaking next Friday at the Cary Arts Center. They're charging $20. I don't know if it's still open, registration's still open. It's either Friday or Saturday next week.
That's awesome. Yeah, if you get a chance to see him, I would see him, and if you can't swing a chance to see him, he has a number of talks on YouTube that are you want something interesting on in the background while you're doing something else. Sometimes I can't sit and watch an entire thing on YouTube. His stuff is fascinating. So for some of us, we start out as gardeners, and trees are this weird other type of plant, right? There's something really entertaining to me about you show a gardener this, and they're like, yes, I could probably figure out how to grow that. And you're like, but how do you grow this? Or how do you grow that Japanese maple? And they're like, I don't know, it's not a plant. You're like, that's not true. They become this special other class, right? I think part of that is because they exist on such a different time scale than we're used to, right? I understand an annual time scale, a 300 to 500 year time scale is a little bit harder for me to really wrap my head around. The growth can be so much slower, but really, These are both just plants, you guys. They're plants. They're not that different. If you can figure out plants, you can figure out trees. Even if you can't figure out annuals, perennials, shrubs, you can still probably figure out trees. They grow a lot more slowly. You have more time to think about what you're going to do. It's fine. So just a little bit of plant biology basics. What makes plants so special? It's really that plants use sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar. This is the whole thing, is that a plant can take and build its body essentially almost the vast majority of it from the air, right? So all those insects, birds, everyone else, this is where their sugar is truly coming from. It's coming from photosynthesis, right? This is why they're absolutely crucial, why their processes are absolutely crucial for everything. They're the basis of basically all terrestrial systems. For the nerds keeping track at home, you're taking carbon dioxide and water, you're turning it into sugars, and you're giving off oxygen, right? So any number of different sugars can then be built from this base, and you're going to build the entire plant body out of that. You are then in turn going to build all of our bodies out of that. You're going to build everything out of that, right? That's where these sugars are coming from. We'll talk a little bit in the soil section about some of the nutrients they need to pull up from the soil, but the vast majority of the matter you see in a plant is coming from the air. They then use those sugars to build structures, survive, reproduce, provide food for everyone else, right? So part of why that's important to think about is because they do have a finite amount of energy. They have a finite amount of sugars that they use, and so they have to make choices about what to do with that. Do I want to grow, or do I want to reproduce if I don't have enough to do both? Do I want to put on leaves, or do I want to just hang out this year because maybe I don't really have enough energy for that, right? So there's all these trade-offs they're making. One just kind of like fun exception to keep in mind is that not all plants photosynthesize. So you have things like Monotropa uniflora, which grows as a parasite on beech roots. Typically, if you see an entirely white plant like that, it's some sort of parasite, right? It is tapping into the roots of something else and stealing its sugars because it figured out how to do that. Variegated plants that we see, right, where you might see a beautiful houseplant where the leaves are half green, half white. In that white tissue, they don't photosynthesize. The reason that's important is because it means that that's not actually helping the plant. So a lot of times those plants will be more delicate, they will grow more slowly, because if you're a beautiful plant with half your leaf white, that half of the leaf is not actually doing anything for you, right? So it's just important to keep in mind that if you pick a tree or a shrub that's got variegated leaves, typically there's a trade-off there in terms of how effectively it can grow. Okay, if I want you to remember one thing about plants, plant cells don't move. Why does this matter? Why does this matter? It's because when I buy a little tree, you know, say he's about this tall and he's got branches, right? If he's going to be a big, mighty oak, all these branches down here, they don't move up. They stay right exactly where they are. Plant cells don't move. And so I know that actually all of the branches I'm seeing at these lower levels, under about 6 feet, are temporary. I'm eventually going to prune them off, right? Because as he grows up, I want to prune enough space that I can walk under it. And so that also means that if some sort of damage happens down low, it's never going to grow up, it's never going to grow in any different direction, it's going to stay exactly where it is. So you have to be really careful, right? This is something that's very unintuitive to us. We kind of move and wiggle around, like our cells do that, right? Like plant cells don't do that. The way that trees grow is they grow by adding cells in two ways. Either primary, where they're getting longer, like imagine a long branch just getting longer. So this is kind of the very tip of either a root or a branch. You have this whole cool population of cells right here called the meristem. They're actually like stem cells. They're undifferentiated like supercells. And those stem cells just add, and they keep getting pushed down the line as they add, right? And so that means that you can always get longer, and then they can do secondary growth where they get wider. So this is like the rings on a tree, right, where they can be adding cells outward. This special class of cells right here, this meristem, you'll hear that referred to as kind of like, you'll hear it referred to as the meristem, but actually those cells also exist in what we call nodes. So, you can tell I'm like scientist by nature. I'm like, ooh, slides, like You can add cells there because then that's where you have the special cells that you need, the meristematic cells. But you can also add them on nodes, right? So if you've ever been pruning a tree or a shrub or anything, you know, you have your main branch and then you have the side branches coming off. That's because there was a node there. There was a special little place where it could add cells. And so if you were to look back, typically, you will see even, it might be easier to draw. If you look along the branch of a tree, so in some places you might have branches, right? But in some places, if you look at it, you'll have almost like a little bud. Have you ever seen this when you kind of look carefully? That's a node. There's meristematic tissue there. This becomes very important when we talk about pruning, and we'll review it then. But basically, these cells are just waiting to explode. Like they're waiting to grow. They want to do that. They're kind of the insurance policy. So if the meristem right up here gets cut off, it's not just like this plant can't grow anymore, right? It's got a backup plan. So if I cut here, all of a sudden this will go like this, right? And so we'll talk about that more with pruning, but just knowing that basically, if I cut here though, and this is why this is an important distinction, this will get longer, but this will never grow like that, right? Because if I don't have a node there, if I don't have a bud there, if I don't have something there already, it can't go and add cells there to be able to do that. It had to have laid that out originally when it was growing. So that becomes really important for pruning and kind of how you plan that, but it's just worth knowing, like, it can't go back and add anything to try and repair. If it wasn't there originally, it's just not there. This is especially important when we think about some of our narrow-leaf evergreens and especially pines. They don't always have those axillary buds, those side buds. So this is why if you have a pine tree and you think that you're just going to prune it back a little bit just to tidy it up, a lot of times it doesn't even have these little buds. So if I prune it back to tidy it up, it's never going to grow back out. It's just going to look funny forever, okay? so know that. Pruning kind of narrow-leaved evergreens, especially pines, is a little bit of an art. I would read about it before you start going with it because otherwise you're going to end up with a weird shape that can't fix itself, okay? That was a little bit sciencey. Are we all feeling okay? But it's just knowing about, they have to have the cells already laid out where they need them. They can't add them later. So the vascular system, we have a vascular system, right? We have a system that carries nutrients through our body. Plants do too. The major parts of the vascular system are the xylem, which transports water and nutrients from the roots to the leaves. So you're carrying water basically up the plant. This is why when a plant gets kind of wilty and dehydrated, that's because there wasn't enough water down here to carry it up, and so you start seeing it up here first, and then it kind of works its way back down. The problem in the wilt works its way back down. You add water here, that water moves straight up to those leaves, and right, it perks back up. The phloem transports sugars from leaves to the rest of the plant. And all of this is just kind of like fun detail for you guys to know. You know, you don't, there are no quizzes here. So the phloem transports sugars, all those sugars that are made in the leaves and the photosynthetic tissue, transports it down to the roots for storage, but transports it to other places. So the phloem, and a lot of times, depending on the season, might move a little bit differently, just where you need sugar at any given time. The cool thing about how this is all organized is that for trees, what we're looking at, these are a group of plants called dicots, where it's actually very, very clearly organized. Where you have, let's see, you can do it. Oh, sorry. You have the xylem on the outside. See these little darker half circles here? It's kind of hard to see. But basically you have these in bundles. The phloem will be on the inside, and then the layer right in between is the cambium. Why does the cambium matter for trees? What is an easy, easy, easy way to kill a tree? Girdle it. Girdle it. So if you take a tree and you just planted your tree and you're like super pumped and you're trying to clean up around the base of your tree and you take that weed whacker and accidentally you just hit the base of that tree all the way around and you see bright green, you've hit the cambium. And you've probably more or less girdled it. You've cut the cambium. The cambium is all of this. It's the xylem, the phloem, that essential vascular system that's right on the outside of the tree. The moment I can have the biggest tree around, and if I cut in just a little bit until I can see bright green, and then that's the cambium, and then I cut through it, dead. Nothing can transport above or below, nothing can move from the roots in any direction, right? And so that's why the vascular system, it's really important to know. So in general, it's also helpful though, because so if I go out and I have a tree and I think it's dead, and I'm like, ugh, what am I doing? Sometimes it's dead, but sometimes it dropped its leaves because it was just having a hard year and the plan is to come back next year. Or it's winter and I don't know if it's gonna leaf out or not. And I can take my nail and I can just scratch that bark. And if I can scratch down and see bright green, the cambium is alive and healthy. So the tree will actually at least that branch will probably come back. Whereas if I scratch down and I see brown, the cambium's dead. And if the cambium's dead, game over, right? But so you have to be careful. You certainly don't want to cut through this vascular system, but it's also really helpful to have it there because it's an easy way to do kind of a health check on a tree you're not sure about. The other reason this is all really, really important is something I kind of mentioned earlier, transpiration. This is the plant version of sweating. So all of this water that's starting down here and moving up, the reason the plant wilts is because it's actually moving up and out, right? So it's moving up and it gets to the surface of the leaves and it evaporates off. And this actually cools plants in the surrounding area because, and this is like, we're going a little bit from biology into physics, but if you think about what's happening here, it takes energy to, move water from a liquid into a gas, to get it to evaporate. The energy for that has to come from the surrounding air. We feel it as heat, but the moment it gets used there, it doesn't hang out as heat anymore, right? That's how sweating works, right? Is because all this heat that's around you evaporates off, your sweat, and the heat that's used in that process is actually used up. That energy is used up. All of a sudden you feel cooler right at that level. And so if you think about something like a massive tree that's always moving water like this, especially if you think about them on a massive urban scale, it's basically like sweating for the entire city. It can cool everything down in a really, really tremendous way, actually. It's one of our major things that when we lose trees, everyone thinks about losing shade. What we're really losing is this sweating capacity. It does require adequate soil moisture. So when it gets really hot out, this kind of starts failing because the trees just don't even have it to do, They have to shut down basically, otherwise they can more or less kill themselves doing this, If you sweat when you're dehydrated, it's not great, It's not really a long-term plan, but something like a large oak tree can transpire actually something like 40,000 gallons a year, So imagine just sweating off 40,000 gallons and everything that would do to cool everything around you. And so we think about trees in an urban environment and we think about them as beautiful and wonderful and green space, but actually from a purely climate perspective, they're one of the absolute best things we can do. We're all trying to reinvent the wheel and figure out some grand new system to fix our urban environments. Just adding more plants and especially more large trees, they can do and have done the majority of this work for us. So we covered this a little bit, but annual growth, This is that secondary growth where it's marching outward every single year, That's what tree rings are. If you look at tree rings, we all know you can count tree rings, but the cool thing is you can also typically tell environmental conditions by tree rings, where you'll have a fat ring for a really good year, they'll have a thin ring for a bad year because they just couldn't grow that much, It's helpful to know that on trees, truly the center of a tree, the heartwood, is more or less dead. You can think of it as dead. So for a lot of times, people will see a big old tree that has a rotten core, Or where I can see straight into the middle and there's like a raccoon looking back at me, But the tree looks good on top. And everyone's like, that tree's rotten, you gotta get rid of it. And I'd be like, you maybe wanna have an assessment done. You can get an arborist out who has a special training to tell you what the risk or the hazard is from that tree. But that central tissue is dead. All that live cambium, the portion we're so concerned about just keeps marching out with the edge of the tree. So if the center begins to rot or begins to break away, there's a structural thing that might be happening there where I'd be worried it would be weakening, but it doesn't necessarily mean the tree's unhealthy. So as we move out, right, so the heartwood, you can consider dead. The sapwood is a little bit helpful, but it's not until you start getting into these very outer cambium layers that you get to the really active, important, growing, healthy part of the tree. I think this is so interesting. Okay, so so what if a tree is injured? So when you or I are injured, we have all these little helper cells and all these other things that kind of go into the scene, right? And they're there to help us, and they're help us to basically heal a wound, right? Plant cells don't move. So no one's coming to help. You have to figure out a way to basically seal it, to create a compartment around that spot. This is a model that was come up with by, I think it was Dr. Alex Shigo. He was like the holy guru of tree people. But it's this idea of compartmentalization of decay. And this we'll talk about more with pruning, but I just want to introduce it now. So I have this long branch here, and then all of a sudden, say I prune it, or a branch breaks off, or something happens, right? And now there's an open wound right where I cut. How in the world is the tree going to heal that? Because it can't heal it the way we would. So the first thing it does is it's actually able to plug up its vasculature above and below the wound. So it can't move cells in, but it can plug it, and so it can stop things from moving up and down, which is really helpful because if a little bacteria crawls in right here or a little fungus crawls in right here, you want to keep that to as narrow of a place as you can, and the easiest way to plug is up and down. Then it goes and it basically starts doing a reinforcement on the inside of that wound. Then if you can imagine looking down, it does kind of a reinforcement like this. And then finally, because this is the hardest one to do because it requires a lot of growth time, it plugs on the outside. And so with pruning, we'll talk about why it's so essential to make your cut where the plant is best at doing this. There is a zone around each branch where it's much better at sealing itself. And if you know where that is, you can kind of set it up for success. But and this is not purely academic. So, right, this is a tree that was taken down and there was rot in the tree, but it perfectly sealed itself along these axes, right? So you have it basically sealing, there's one here, that would have been your first wall. Your second wall it tried to get back here, but it didn't get fast enough. But then it was able to do these third walls, right, looking down like pie slices. But see, that was such a long wound that it just had trouble really properly doing it. But I mean, even just seeing these really super clear, like, pie wedges, right? This is how they seal themselves on the inside. And so on these really, really long wounds like this, it's going to be really hard for a tree to heal itself. Whereas if we can do that in a really targeted way to prevent something like that, or at least to be pruning so we don't cause something like that, it's going to have a much better success. So what they always say is people heal, but trees seal, right? All right, roots. So a lot of what you need to know about roots we've covered actually in the meristem section, because all those things about how we grow at the top, right, where you have the growth at the very tip, and then you have your nodes, and you have your side branches, roots are the exact same, they're just underground, right? Like they're doing all the same thing. You have root meristems, you have root buds, you have all this kind of stuff just underground. But for a tree, what's really important to keep in mind is that the roots that we think of as being so crucial are not the most important roots for that tree. So you have the absorbing roots are actually by far the most important. The absorbing roots are the ones that go out as far as the drip line. This is the drip line. It's kind of the outside edge of the tree. And a lot of times they even go further. So one description that I always really like is that a tree is like a wine glass on a dinner plate, right? So it's kind of small on top, and then there's this massive network. And a lot of times they're only about 12 inches deep. They're really high. They're at the surface, if not even more shallow than that. They're super fine. You can barely see them. And they're the ones that are so small that they're actually taking up all the nutrients. They're doing kind of all the really, really essential work of feeding that tree. The lateral roots are a lot of times the ones that we run into first, right? They're the ones that are like buckling our sidewalks and we're getting kind of frustrated by because we keep tripping over them or whatever, Those roots are important, and I would certainly never damage more of those than I needed to, but they're more supportive in a lot of ways. And finally, the sinker roots A lot of times trees actually don't have much in terms of sinker roots. Certain trees have tap roots, but a lot of them, the roots that go down deep and really anchor, it's not really worth a tree's effort to put all that into roots, because those roots that go down so deep, we'll talk about this with soil, there's very little nutritive value down there. It's way more worth it to put your energy into the topsoil where all the nutrients are. So, I mean, we've all seen, right, one of these big willow oaks tipped over after a storm. And I think we all have the exact same response where we're like, that thing was barely rooted at all. Like, how is it staying in the ground? Like, it must have been old and sick. And you're like, it was old. However, that's kind of how trees grow for the most part, right? And so the reason that trees tip in storms especially is because if we've had a lot of rain and the soil is nice and soft and wet, and then you have something like this, and you have a big wind come through, this is essentially a sail at this point. It's catching all that wind, and especially when you get heavy wind after, a week of rain, it's just hard for them, it's hard for them to support themselves, right? Because they put all their energy into these really, really tall, or these really high roots, right? Those sort of absorbing roots. This isn't a problem for a tree living in a forest, which is how many of our trees evolved to live, because they have their kind of friends to support them. But for that single big tree out in the middle of a field, right, there are no other trees around to kind of push back as it sways. The lateral roots, the absorbing roots, which are so essential, this is why we can also have a really hard time with things like planting in the house strip, or having streets nearby, having sidewalks nearby, having construction nearby. It's because you imagine this big tree, and then the street gets put right here, right? Absorbing roots can't absorb anything there. And then maybe this homeowner starts deciding to do construction, and they're trying to be respectful, but they're cutting right about here where the sidewalk is. And then all these absorbing roots are taken out, and all of a sudden this tree really doesn't have much area that it can take up nutrients from. This was one I saw when I was out walking, and these trees have actually survived so far, which I've been amazed by, and I feel bad because I know that this person was like trying to do the right thing. Like, I could tell they were like pumped about what was happening. But they had these two young straight trees, and they had kind of like not good looking grass growing underneath, kind of weedy grass. And so they decided to till up this entire area so they could put in like mondo grass, I think it was, something that would be more of a kind of a perennial that they wouldn't have to care for as much. And like, these trees survived, but I'm frankly shocked, right? Because when you till up this whole area, even if you never touch either of those trees, what have you done to their absorbing roots? Cut them, right? They're gone. So that tree will have to massively regrow all of that. And like, these guys were young enough that I think they pulled through, but like, I keep an eye on them. And so part of what's fun about this, right, is that we think about roots, but what's also essential are the roots and their relationship to the soil microbiome and soil fungus. And so we have fungal relationships called mycorrhizal relationships, where basically you will have a tree or a plant. A lot of plants do this, although not all plants, which is cool. And basically they'll form these really, really close relationships between their roots and certain fungus in the soil, and it tends to vary by species of tree or plant. And so as far as those roots can go, the fungus can go even further. And they're basically doing a trade where what it is the fungus is taking all those sugars that the tree was able to make, or the plant was able to make. It's taking that while it's giving water and minerals to the plant, right? So everyone kind of benefits. This is kind of a cool picture of a little pine. And so the root system comes in right about here, and then all of this becomes fungal, right? And so that actually really massively expands the reach of what that plant has access to. And there's some research, although it's a little bit, I think, oversold, but I think it'll be interesting to see kind of how it ends up, where you might be having relationships forming between trees by fungal relationships, right? So this guy has his fungus going out this way, this one has his fungus going out this way, then those two fungus meet, and are they able to communicate in any way? Are they able to share information? This was a really hot topic of research for probably the past 5 to 10 years, and everyone got really excited, and they're like, they're all best friends, and they're throwing parties constantly. And you're like, maybe. It's possible that they communicate, and it would be interesting to know what that communication is, right? So I would take some of that research with a grain of salt, but it is clear that they are massively expanding their reach. through fungal relationships. All right, so we're going to transition. We're going to talk a little bit about soil, but our break is coming fairly soon. Don't worry. Okay. Or do we need to stretch our legs now? We can stretch our legs now. How are we all feeling? All right. I hit one nod. I'm into it. All right, let's take like a 5-minute break.